Hi guys, everyone can hear me okay? And I'm hoping everyone else's mics are on. Thanks so much for coming out tonight, not only to Iyapo Repository, but also to tonight's talk. It's a pleasure to see a full room. I think for lay of the land this evening, I will introduce myself. My name is Jara Patrick, and I joined Macalester College as gallery director and curator now a year ago. So I'm still somewhat of a new face. And then I think we'll introduce our artists and then have about maybe 30 to 40 minutes of conversation and then open up the floor for questions. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and I will run a mic to you so that we can capture your question and have a little continuity between your comment and what's going on the panel. So I want to say a huge thanks to all of our panelists tonight. We have closest to me, Salome Asega, and Salome is a Brooklyn-based artist and researcher whose practice celebrates dissensus and multivocality. You've worked on numerous projects, which I hope that you'll share with us tonight, but most importantly, the Iyapo Repository. Next to Salome is Mariama Jalloh. Am I saying your last name right? Jalloh. Okay. And Mariama and I have worked very closely together the last couple days as you're the chief conservator, should we say? Senior conservator of the repository. and talented in many ways. And next to Mariama is Crystal Moten. And Crystal is a professor with us here at Macalester. I mean, some of you may have had courses with her. She's been here since 2016, so we're kind of like the new kids. So your title is Assistant Professor of African American History. Prior to coming to Minneapolis, you were a Chicago native. And you'll share a bit about some of the coursework that you've developed around some of the ideas that are shared here with the artists. And next to Crystal is Okunseinde. And Ayo is the other half of Iyapo Repository and has been on hand doing all of the install, configuring all of the monitors, and we'll share more about some of the tech that's used within the exhibition. And on the right of Ayo is Leola Johnson, who has had a long time here at Macalester, serving as chair for over 10 years, I believe, in the digital media department. 15. See, I owe you a bit more credit there. But not this year. You've been able to take a seat. So I think what we'll do tonight is just allow casual conversation among panelists. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions about the exhibition. I think a nice way to start off might be from Ayo and Salome to just hear a bit more about the background of the project and some of the ideas that may have fueled this work. So I'm going to pass my mic off to Leola, but if you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll keep an eye out.
Hello.
Hello.
we should do like a synchronized hello.
We should practice. We should rehearse that. Yeah. Okay. Next time, guys.
We're so excited and we're so happy to be here. This show is actually the largest collection of work that we've shown from this project. It's a massive space, and I'm so excited. Thank you, Jara. And thank you, Macalester. So I think we could start by talking about I-Beam, perhaps. So we went to grad school together. So Lomi graduated 1 year. She was a year ahead of me, and after graduation, we sort of linked back up and decided to work together. And so we started this project at I-Beam, which is a media center in New York. And yeah, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had Ayo and I remember having like a brain jam like in the back of a coffee shop around like all the things we were thinking about in the year like 2014. Thinking a lot about policing, specifically in New York City. We're thinking about how we just came out of this amazing grad program where we had like tons of access to tech resources, amazing professors in fields of design and art. And we're just thinking about, great, now we're out, we've been birthed into the world, and not everyone in our community has had access in the way that we had. How can we sort of leverage our privilege out? And then we were also thinking about participatory technology, social engagement, and so we kind of came up with this project that sits very much in like our love for science fiction. The name even Iyapo Repository comes from an Octavia Butler book. Lilith Iyapo is a character in her Xenogenesis trilogy series where Lilith Iyapo is the last remaining human being that resembles people of our kind, humans of our kind. So we pay homage to her. So yes, we started from this place, and then we came up with this narrative for Iyapo Repository, which is a resource library that exists in a nondescript future. It has 4 divisions. A manuscript division, so if you were in the gallery already, it's the wall that has all the worksheets. There's the art and artifacts division, which draws from the manuscripts, so all the sketches become, not all of them, but most of them, some of them, a select few, become like real life technological objects that are like fully functioning. So that's our art and artifacts division. And then we have a moving image division where we make short video loops, films about the finished artifacts. And then we have a rare media division, which houses just texts, JPEGs, movie files, PDFs of things that have influenced our work. And sometimes we ask guest academics, artists, musicians to curate a USB port for us.
So one of the really, so for me, and I think for Salome as well, while I was at the program, I was like, I want to create art and sort of create an art from this top-down perspective where I'm the one deciding the parameters, I'm the one deciding the concept. And I think one of the great things about this project that I love is that it comes from the bottom up. So we work with different communities, different groups, people of African diaspora to generate ideas about what they envision of this future. So as Salome says, Iyapo Repository exists in this nondescript future. So we always do this, or I always do this. This is a timeline where this over here is the future and this is the present. So Iyapo Repository exists here and it collects artifacts from the past, from their past, which is our future. So the idea was to try to get these communities to sort of envision these artifacts that exist in that space. And by just the way that we look at artifacts from the past to understand cultures of the past, and we interpret those artifacts to sort of gain an understanding of how people lived and how people survived in the past, we can look at these artifacts that exist in the future to understand how people exist in that future and to understand their culture as well. Let's
Yes,
yeah.
yes, yes.
Okay. When I first heard, is this on? Okay. When I first heard about the project, I was in the exhibition. I was really happy because as a historian, and especially a historian who focuses on black women's history, the question of the archive and repository is really always forefront in my mind. I think about the story of when I entered graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I always knew I wanted to study black women's activism, black women's history, but from the readings I had been reading, I had been told that, well, they are not in the archive. They are not there, so you are going to have to craft the narrative out of a negative object or artifact. And so the question of who gets to be in the archive, how do we create the archive, is the archive accessible, and then how do we interpret the archive is something that really resonates with the work that I do and with the women that I study. And so this idea about what is the archive, or how do we create an archive for the type of future that history that we want in the future, is one that I grapple with. I study particularly black working class women who are typically not represented in kind of the formal text that historians use to grapple with the past. And so I wrote an article about black working class women, and my question was, what do we need to do right now to make sure the histories of black working class women are present and accounted for 50 years from now when we go to write the history of this contemporary moment. Mm-hmm. And so exhibitions like this really ask us to consider what does our future look like?
I think the mic is.
It's just not on.
What does our future look like? What does our future? Oh, yes. What does our future look like? But that, in order to answer that question, we need to think about that right now and in this present moment. And so that is why I was so excited for this exhibition.
Well, so I was really excited about this project for a number of reasons, and one of them is because of the position I occupy on the timeline. You know, and it seemed to me that I'm a baby boomer, a millennial. I graduated actually from high school. This year is my 50th. Don't tell anybody that. High school reunion, and the year that the Detroit incident happened, the Algiers Motel incident, and my first encounter with this kind of thinking about the future work systematically was when Macalester in 2005 co-sponsored a exhibition on Afrofuturism at this little gallery, hipster gallery called, don't tell them I said they were hipsters, called the Soap Factory. And they brought in all kinds of working artists, including Colette Gator, who at that point was at the University of Minnesota, but is now at Delaware. All kinds of digital artists. This is 2005. And so one of the most interesting things about that exhibit for me was that there were all kinds of people who were genuinely from the baby boom generation, in the sense that they were Black nationalists. They were artists and they were Black nationalists. And then there were all these young people, much younger than I am, who worked in digital art. And the Black nationalists were suspicious of the young people, the digital artists. And my assignment was, of course, to talk about movies. That's always my assignment at every program I'm in. And to talk about, especially sort of near future science fiction. So the film I talked about at that exhibit was The Spook Who Sat by the Door, right? Which is a very interesting and sexist text. But in any case, that was my first encounter. And the generational crossover of that work was so appealing to me. It reminded me of, there's this very famous documentary called The Last Angel of History that talks about African Americans as data thieves, as people who borrow from every moment of the timeline, put it all together, and mix it up, and think about the future in terms of stealing from the past. So anyway, I've been making those are my connections. I think that's the contribution I can make, not just because of my age, but also because of my discipline.
I think it's like, I appreciate you telling us this story, because I think we've had conversations recently about how what we're doing is nothing new. Like, it already operates under an established legacy of creating self-determined futures. And when we talk about this work, that we need to acknowledge what was happening in the 60s in terms of like Black people creating their own systems, like looking at groups like the Black Panthers and seeing like how when they're creating the free breakfast program, they're creating a system for themselves, because nothing under like status quo is helping them, So so when we are building these tools, it's people have been doing that forever. So this is survival technology,
And I think in reference to, with regards to that, in reference to the term Afrofuturism, I know that language is so important. to be able to couch all of this work in something that's palatable, something that's easily transmittable, I think one can use the term Afrofuturism. But I know that we've had discussions about, does that really encompass everything that we do? Is that term too restrictive? So the notion that the work that we're doing has been done before in different flavors, then that it's about the past as well as about the future. And I feel that Afrofuturism sometimes tends to just the notion of it is that it only exists in the future, whereas what we're trying to do deals with the present, deals with the past, deals with recontextualizing past, present, and future.
At least for me, when I first joined Iyapo Repository, what was really important to me and like spoke to me really well is this idea of stories and how a lot of Black history is passed down traditionally orally, and is passed down in like warnings, is passed down in music, is passed down in a way that is not documented and academically studied or preserved in the same sort of way. And for me, Iyapo Repository was in a way a documentation of that. And because I personally care a lot about having things academically studied. I believe in the scientific method hardcore. So like even like when it came down to like deciding for my senior project what to study, and for us I was a computer science student, I chose hair braiding, and I showed like how it is connected and has embedded mathematics, and it has the same principles that we core principles found in computer science and all of that by visually showing that. And to me, all these things, all these cultural practices that even by people who are Black get to always be pigeonholed, or this static view of like what Black history is, or like what all these things that spring from, only has to do with this resistance against race rather than actual human need to create things that are natural and has to do with mathematics and things that we have come to discover and make sense of the world in terms of language, in terms of how we relate to one another. And to me, that all of it is encompassed with the technological things that we do at Iyapo, and like the way we even talk about the works, and like the kind of things like having, like, think about it, drawing on a piece of paper and having someone else create that physical object that they will show as part of their work to other people and speak about it in a way that has little to do with a destroyed civilization that we can no longer connect to, but rather the idea that human life and all of it is adding to this human theory, and how we are all building for this idea of connecting to one another in a way through language, and whether it's through a physical object and things like that. And to me, that's why I like doing this and why this is important to me. And a lot of it, even like the conversation about like the working class women and the Black Panthers, like the reason why it doesn't exist is because sometimes it's not studied properly. Like for example, if I forget who did it, but there was this study of how the Black Panther women wore jeans during that time, and a lot of them were like, that was their workwear, their uniform, in showing that they were activists, they were like out there working for their ideas and stuff. And to me, that's not documented in the same way, because for people it's like you have to go out and like show like you're being a civil disobedient person in a certain way, in a way that is proper, but rather there's these subtle things that women do that is strategic, that is about maneuvering in a space that is never talked about, and all of that is encompassed when we allow people to draw and imagine things for themselves and create that, that exists within their lives. And I think that's what's really important, and that's what needs to be documented.
I just want to say one thing about technology. Technology. And so Salome and I study technology. You want to build something that you could control from around the world, we could do it. The Minority Report you know, or Google Glass, we could do that. But for us, I don't think that's necessarily like, for us, technology goes beyond that. It's also in the way that objects sort of speak to each other. So the idea of the shell and the film that we created with the shell, where you pick up the shell and you could hear the ancestral grandmothers. It's also embedded in the notion of the oracle, or the notion of divination, or the notion of ritual. So I think for us, the ability to blend what I call capital T technology with small t technology, or maybe it should be reversed, to be able to blend that, where magic and technology and stories and narratives all play a part in informing the individual, and sort of moving the individual along in life, and sort of creating an environment for an individual to envision the future, I think is very important to us.
Can I say one more thing about technology?
Yeah.
Most of it has sort of built-in biases, right? Most of them are kind of function and operate off of rule sets that are racist or like privileged. Yeah. Or, you know, kind of privileged, maleness, whiteness, able-bodiedness. And so Simone Brown writes a lot about this. But so here we are, like a group of designers, right? Design strategists sitting in a room workshopping ideas for tools for a future where technology can actually serve us, and is built by us for us. And I think that that's important, that when you get people in the room, because we're all designers. I don't know, design has been like industrialized in this way that like you can't do it unless you have the degree that says you can do it, but we all do it every day. And so it's just great to like sit in a room with people during these workshops and sort of build technologies that are for us.
And I wanted to pick up on that, because I think we live in an era now where we think about the possibilities of technology, and even I'm happy to hear you think about some of the critique that we can have in technology. And so I'm thinking, what if we continue kind of thinking about this current moment and thinking about access? What are some of the limitations, right, of thinking about a future repository or archive for the future based solely on technology, when even though the majority of people perhaps have access, but we don't have access to creation. We have access to consuming technology, but we are not, and I'm speaking about Black people, people of color, we are not the creators of the technology. The technology right now is using us. So what are your kind of thoughts about that and creating in this medium?
I teach at 92nd Street Y in New York, and I could count on my hand. I've been teaching there for years, and I could count on one hand, the number of children of color that have come through that program. And I teach Lego robotics, I teach Arduino, I teach technology, and it troubles me sometimes, because I think to myself, oh wow, I'm teaching all of this. I wish I could have children of color in here so they could learn, and then they could become part of, the developers and the programmers, because that is so important. I think I always go back to Caroline Sender wrote an article in, was it The Atlantic? No? Fast Company recently, that talks about, it was a letter to Elon Musk that basically says, enough worrying about artificial intelligence, enough worrying about computers taking over and the singularity, that we have serious issues right now with algorithms that discriminate, and all of that comes from the fact that it can be easily fixed by having more people of color, or more diversity in that level where you actually start programming and start making those applications. And I think it's education, and I think it's just trying to get more people into those fields. Yeah.
Actually, I have a story about this. One of my professors wanted a website built around creating like an archive, like a streaming archive of like Zimbabwean books and like media and stuff. But the student that she has working on it was a friend of mine who's a web developer, but the thing is he's white, so his ideas on how this should be placed and how things should exist on this wasn't made for Zimbabweans or people who are used to interacting with that sort of content. And then what you have is like there was an introduction page, and I remember looking at it and being like, why do you need an introduction page when if they see they know it's this person's book, you know? And a part of that, as like someone who's like a computer science student, I was the only black girl I was actually the only girl in my entire class, but also, and for me, the way I even got there was I tried every social science first, to be honest, and then decided I didn't like it. And then I was like, all right, I liked history, but it wasn't something that yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I end up there 'cause my parents are much more like, they don't understand if you can't do something. It has nothing to do with gender. It's like, so why didn't you get 100? So there were that kind of people, which kind of allowed me to be able to do certain things in a sense that it can't be that hard if someone else is doing it, according to them. So so in a way, that was what allowed me to like go past that. All of the students in my grade and we're doing art or journalism. I don't have a single friend who's in computer science and is a girl. And so a lot of it has to be about like deciding how you exist and within that space is also easier because you're the only person there. So what you have to do is like, for me, I just only took female professors, to be honest, because it was easier to like engage and have people who I can connect to more and who understand what the kind of things that I'll be interested in that has nothing to do with like hacking into like random stuff, you know. So I mean, like, it's really a serious issue because it's like if you want a website built that has to do with like you wanting to preserve a certain part of your culture and you don't know how to code that or understand that it's really easy to like make a website, then you are stuck with having to pay someone a lot of money who also doesn't understand the cultural background or the ideas around it. And even no matter how much you explain to them, it will be coming in from a place of not making this a usable site, because part of making a site is understanding your users. And if you don't understand your users, your site sucks. And that was one of the things that I realized why accidentally, even though it was accidental, why it was so important for me to continue doing this and like being part of that technology in a way.
Yeah, you know, what's also really interesting is to think about the politics of the kind of work that you're doing. I was looking on your website and I hooked into a link from the MIT Media Lab that featured this little boy from Sierra Leone who was 14. Or and right, I mean that's pretty amazing. Was that a TED talk?
No, his name is DJ Focus, Kelvin Doe.
Yeah.
He was sifting through e-waste sites in his city and was able to build his own pirate radio station and then would DJ Afrobeat and as like a 14-year-old, and the story went viral as things do, feel-good stories do on the internet now.
Yeah.
And then he was invited to MIT to do a fellowship and has come back and forth a bunch. Yeah.
And he had a mentor who was from Sierra Leone at MIT.
And teaches, yeah.
Yeah, and it was all really interesting in the stories that he was trying to tell and the, you know, but having looked at that MIT program for years and years and years, that program is sponsored by huge corporations. The MIT, you know, by the big media tech corporations and so forth. And so I keep asking myself, how can this be a bottom up? endeavor when the people who can sponsor it are Facebook, you know, Twitter, GE, and, you know, those kinds of places. How do we get out of that contradiction?
So I would like to perhaps propose something, and it's not a solution. Um, and I don't necessarily believe in solutions all the time. And this comes from the design, from our design background. Like, you want to build a chair. You're a designer, you want to build something to sit on, you build a chair, and you sit on it. Solution. There's some problems that are bigger than that, that by the time you finish the solution, the problem has changed. By the time you finish the solution, you need 100 years to see if it's actually solvable, right? And those are, we call those wicked problems. And something like that is a wicked problem, whereby it's so intricate, it's so immense, it has so many moving parts that you can't really target one. So to try to design a solution for that in the traditional design sense, I think is folly. I think the way that one might be able to do that is actually with stuff that we're doing by proposing a speculation, by speculating about a future and solving a problem in that future, bringing that solution to the present as a way of a critique on that, on the present situation, and thereby changing the way people perceive, changing the way people's ideas about that, and then moves that trajectory. So it's something that I think it's a lot more subtle. It's something that is that takes probably more time. No, I don't know, but I think that might be a way to do that. So I have this project where I walk around in this spacesuit, African space. I'm an African spaceman from the future, and every time I put on that suit, I love the fact that little children of color see me and they yell, "Oh, look, it's an African astronaut," and I'm just like, "Oh, yes, you know, yes." And yes, we've had African astronauts, but nobody thinks of Africa as, oh yeah, African astronaut, you know. And in the same vein, there's this project, or used to be this project, the Lebanese Rocket Society, that sort of addresses that as well, where Lebanon at some point had a university. They were developing rockets. They were they were like really moving forward, but that dream was squelched by geopolitical entities, by big corporations, by Russia and the USSR and the US, and it sort of squashed that dream. But to be able to talk about that, to be able to produce projects that allow people to open their mind to that sort of possibility, I think then allows for this collective understanding that it is possible to make that happen. Just by talking about these issues now, and having dialogue about it, it now becomes even more possible, and even more possible, and even more possible.
But I just don't think that it has to do with just like a participation or like a visibility now. I think part of it is a lack of information. And like the fact is that I don't think that like there has been so many instances that goes undocumented where Black people are engaged in these ideas, in these things that we're talking about, like in science, history, and all these stuff, but it's just not documented. The information is not available, and there has been such a negligence in the Black community, if we will give responsibility to Black community, or in the idea of even studying Black history outside of just like what did we do, rather than how did this affect us, you know, rather like what did we do, what have we been doing, who's doing what, you know. Those things are not talked about. There's just always this focus of like resistance and of like compartmentalizing all our history from the lens of what has been done to us rather than what we have done, and like what does that look like. And I think like for me, at least for me growing up, like most of my life was surrounded by this idea of what people are doing rather than what, even if it was like just getting married, you know, it was more of like an event, like you're doing this because you wanted to do this. And like I didn't need to see a Black woman in computer science or all these things to want to do that. It was just the possibility of understanding I have autonomy as a person, and like, and that is not documented, that is not shown. It's like, we need more black people in this, we need more black people in that. We don't need that. Like, there should be less focus on this idea of like what we need to have be done, how we need to, like, racism doesn't matter in a social perception to me. It matters in the institution sense, and having policies be changed in that way. But when it comes to these conversations about how we socially relate to one another, it should not only focus on what can we do now to like create this sense that we're doing stuff, rather than actually studying that and seeing and finding those people and bringing out the archive and creating that place of presence, like hidden figures and like stuff like that, because they exist, is there. I don't know, sorry. I just got
Okay.
I mean, I was what I was gonna say was going back to your question around like getting out of taking maybe like dirty resources or dirty money, right? But I've been working with these groups like Yellow Jackets Collective or Bufu, By Us For Us, and these like, like queer young artist collectives that kind of like exist on the internet and like host social spaces, and how they sort of like lean into taking these resources from people, right? They call it scamming. And like thinking about scamming as like a political act, like a subversive act. You don't just scam institutions, you can scam systems of oppression, right? Like they had a beautiful event called Scamming the Patriarchy that invited tons of women and femmes, young women and femmes of color to a museum, and they hosted all-day workshops around like how to work through and past oppressive patriarchal systems, And so leaning into it sometimes is like a political act, an act of resistance of saying, I will take your money and I will do what I want to do with it, Goodbye.
Yeah. I think all of that, connects to, in terms of scamming or skimming, was it?
Scamming.
Scamming plus thinking about the question of the focus of history being one that is what has been done to us instead of what are we doing. I think my go-to is always, if we look to black women, if we look to black feminist thought, if we look to the knowledges and the intellectual creation that black women have always done, we can then reframe the story. Because when I think of scamming or scamming, Okay. Again, kind of hearkening back to the history that we always want to erase and discredit. Black women have been doing that since forever. I think of particularly historian Stephanie Camp, her work thinking about black women and resistance and being truant from the plantation, or taking resources from the big house and distributing them among the other enslaved folk. That's not new, right? And so we have this history. And the point I was getting at is that when we don't write our own history, then we get these narratives about what has been done to us instead of what are we doing and how are we contributing and how are we creating. But my answer is that when we look to black women, then we can see that black women have always been concerned about the creation, right, and the perpetuation of survival and resistance of our community, but we don't like to look to black women, right? We like to erase them from the archive, right? And so when we do that, then we get this incomplete collection of stories and narratives. And so, black feminists always say if we figure out who is at the bottom and empower them and give them the resources, when and where I enter, the whole race comes with me. That's Anna Julia Cooper, right? And so when we bring that into the conversation, then we get a fuller, we can think of, we can interpret the past, we can reconsider the present, and then think about, okay, what is this future gonna look like for all of us, right? Black women were just not concerned about black women, it was all of us.
Yeah, because we carry all those problems. So, like, in generally speaking, at least for me, I've always come to understand my role to always be more like generally how I'm seen, like I'm Muslim also, so like that's another layer of like resistance in terms of how I should present myself and how I should be like, or what I should really actually even want to do with my life, which is like, that's why I have my third marriage proposal. And I'm only 23, so. So a lot of it has to do with like understanding, at least for me, because I really, like I was actually, it all happens because I was looking for recipes. And I realized I couldn't find any that were written by black, like not a lot, unless it's like out of text or like old out of print, that was written about, written by black women, that is not about decolonized African food. I mean, that is not about colonized African food. That is not about like food, even here, that has to do with the history of slavery, you know, like even like Southern food itself and all these things all are tinged with this idea that has nothing to do with so much of the food that I've also experienced in real life and eaten in real life, that and how even it's looked at and talked about by people who are black and all that surrounds me. Like, it's all on a context that is not decolonized. And for me, like, that's the most important thing right now, is the how we study and look at black history, and not even just as women, but as people in general. And like, not even in the context of like feminism or anything. It's like, what is this thing? You know, like, how do we understand this, and how do we actually look at it, and what is the breakdown of, and how did it come to this place? Where did it travel from? The same way, like, we know that tea first came from China, and the way that it linguistically changed, it was dependent on whether or not it moved through north. So, and then if it's through north, I think it was tea, and then through the south, it was cha. I could be wrong about the thing, but that's how we know that. We know that linguistically speaking. We also know that in the 1600, white people was first coined, and all these things exist in history because there was playwrights who was the first person who ever used it, that is known, like the white people thing. But like, the fact that that exists and I can know that information, and I don't know where like certain sources first were made by African women who has been making it years after years, and it's only orally like spoke about and understood, that is a problem in my opinion. And it has nothing to do with whether or not we have to look to black women, for me at least, because it's like, what are the rest of the world doing, and how is it that the narrative is always going to be about men and how men live their life, and this idea of the individual or figuring out or coming to be into yourself is always told from a male perception, you know, like this idea of discovering oneself. And like, how do women do that? How do we navigate that? How do we end up becoming feminine, and even in general? And like, for me, that's why this is so important of a project, because the imagination allows that, you know, allows that to be defined and allows that to be created in real life, in real time. For me, the past exists in the future because our past issues are never solved, and we can only move into the future if our past issues do not exist in the present, and they do. And as a result, we don't have a future. We are only living in the past. So I need documentation. I need ideas. I need things that is not only about looking to black women, but rather as taking it seriously and being studied in a way that matters, in the way that we study math, computer science, and all these subjects, not as a side or something that is not rigorous or serious or that's frivolous. And that's my issue with even like how it's being talked about.
So, you know, one of the things that I remember thinking when we did that 2005 exhibit at the soap factory, and when I watched my peers, the old baby boomers complain about the people who were doing digital art, was that they were really interested in, and they were really angry with the younger people for not promoting a kind of fixed idea of blackness. Right? I mean, they were like, right? So they were really, I mean, they were much more flexible than the people of my generation would be. And part of it is because there were a lot more immigrants, you know, among that generation, that younger generation of black people. But also the artists had these really interesting ideas about race that were like, didn't have anything to do with sight, because it, you know, it was all on the internet. I mean, it was all digital and so forth. And so I think that that tension still exists, but that generational tension still exists, and that younger people want and require a more flexible definition of blackness than those of us who are from the southern plantation diaspora.
And I was my forcefulness about black feminism, which I'm not going to apologize for, is because if you really think about black feminism, as I mentioned, is not about coming to an exclusionary understanding of race, of gender, of sexuality, of any of the pieces of our identity, right? But it's about thinking about those pieces from the moment, the places where they converge, right? And so it's not a closure of possibilities. It's actually an opening. Yes.
Yeah, I feel like
yes.
black feminism gives us like the most open definition of blackness, because it's like the sort of it's like the one framework for thinking that understands intersectionality, right? And how like gender and sexuality and all these other sort of identity markers intersect with like our race. But yeah.
I just want to say a word sort of related to what you're saying about I don't know how to express it, because it's something I'm still working on in terms of blackness and the diversity of blackness and how that is curtailed in America. So I'm Nigerian. I grew up different in Europe and the Middle East, and I come to the States, and it seemed like all the layers of blackness that existed within me were just smashed into one, and that one is just black. And as a result of that, you, every single black person here is one person. They're just black. And it doesn't account for any sort of variation, any sort of nuance, any sort of delicacy in one's expression. And I think that perhaps that plays a role in this idea of what is black in America, what is considered black in America. And I think from my understanding, it's not until sort of recently that has started to sort of expand into a whole lot of different expressions. And I find that really exciting. And I'm still trying to figure out, for me as a Nigerian person in the States, and having all these ideas of what my culture is, and then being perceived as just this thin line of blackness. What does that say about me? What does that say about the way I perceive myself, the way other people perceive me, and my understanding of myself and blackness in America. Yeah.
Well, I get to ask the first question. I'm hoping this will eventually be formed into a question by the time I get to the end. I think I have a question that sort of deals with something that both of you two have said. I apologize, I'm just pointing at you, but Leola, about this kind of using the tools that are at hand and trying to kind of bespoke that system in some way. So I'm an architect who works as an installation artist, and I think that in some ways that speculative space is the opportunity to kind of address some other themes that I'm trying to pull out in my work. And so I think this kind of bespoking of the system in a way kind of ties into what you were saying about this generational divide and these kind of multiple understandings of blackness. And so that there may have been some more monolithic conception before, and now we are like tweaking that in some way. And so I guess I'm wondering if you in the collective can talk about this kind of the process and the specific tools that you're using to bespoke that system. So in a technological space, like what does that look like in terms of the actual technology, the actual like the rule set, the new algorithm? Like, what does that actually look like in the context of this like more hegemonic kind of way of doing things? And then, I mean, it might be kind of too multi-layered to talk about how that's reflecting this kind of like multi-layered understanding of blackness, but I think in some ways they're kind of tied together, that like in this speculative space where you can kind of tweak the tool, you can break open these definitions in some way. So
I think I know Salome has a lot to say about this, so I'm just going to say a little bit and then Joe. Salome and I have discussions about this all the time, and I think I'm just going to talk about two things. One is the sort of aesthetic and perhaps the technological, and I think we touched on the technology a little bit. The aesthetic, when you see an art piece, and this is a consideration that I had created in my astronaut suit. I wanted to create an astronaut suit, but what is an astronaut suit? You know, and for my thesis committee, you know, for everybody that sees this, it has to reference Africa, right? How does it reference Africa? Why does it need to have like African fabric to represent Africa? You know, why does the work that we create have to reference this sort of traditional sense? You know, like we're moving forward, like why do we have to create something that looks like it's from the 1800s? So yeah, so just aesthetic. Exactly. So just aesthetically, like how do we get around that? So we've had discussions about that with the Iyapo Repository, and then the other thing is the technology aspect. Mariama has been digging deep into machine learning, and I'm doing the same, digging into machine learning, and we're trying to just try to understand it, right? Trying to understand what exactly is this thing that machines are capable of understanding and experiencing, and how can we, I don't know if it's to inject our sensibilities into it, or how could we use it as a tool? So one of the projects that I'm working on is talking about language and sort of decolonizing language. We sit in here all speaking English, you know, but English has certain things. It has, like, it's restrictive. It does this. It does that. You know, it has a history. How do we take that away from it? So how do we use technology to do that? So by using machine learning, create a set of glyphs that are based on Veve, Haitian Veve, or West African Yuli, and create this language that is not a spoken language, but it transmits from the visual to the haptic. So a device reads it and transmits it directly into the body. So no need for the spoken language itself. But to do that, we need to sort of address technology and to sort of, yeah.
Like, for example, like understanding like neural networks, which is like basically how a picture is even read by a machine and how we identify things in machine, because it's all, if you think about it, it's information. And it's like, how do you tell this machine to learn to recognize a car? You know, you can easily recognize a car, but like the question becomes, it's like, how do you inform that, and like how do you show the machine what to do and also leave it on its own to develop those skills by itself, which is just the idea of like training it like your way your brain has been trained. And like one of the things that I'm doing right now is having it recognize text on a picture, and sometimes what it does is that if it's the shape of is oblique or is diagonal, it completely is unable to recognize it. It's like, what is that? I don't recognize that. And like, but it will also tell you the loss percentage that is having in recognizing stuff in the picture, which is kind of like our human brain, which is only focused on our survival, and so pretty much it only predicts the rest. That's why you tend to come to the wrong conclusion. So in a way, it's as human as it possibly can be. So which is also the other fascinating part for me. But I also disagree about the African clothing thing. I think that it's as modern and interesting to be used, and it's only othered because there exists Western clothing. And it's actually higher value because you have to have it tailor-made.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it's beautiful. I love it. But I think that if you're contemporary African artist, you don't need to say contemporary African artist. You're a contemporary artist. And what does it mean to say, okay, you're a contemporary African artist? It really means that they're expecting some sort of reference to Africa. And it's like, no, I should just be able to make art. And it comes out of me. And as a result of that is contemporary African art. Yeah. And it doesn't need the, what's the term for it?
Reference to it or the,
yeah, the
costume. But I think that for me at least, like, I used to feel that way, and then personally it just changed for me, because if I decide to, like, I want to make the costume out of Hollandaise wax blocks, it will be that, because it's not even so much as a reference to it as just as I'm using any other fabric at this point.
I think that what he's saying though is that sort of for like for curators, or the sort of romantic African imagination takes as like exactly that sort of narrative trumps anything that you're doing. And it's like what Camila, and I don't know if it's actually, I don't think it's in the catalog essay, but we had a really great conversation about how curators tend to quickly read. They like scan Black artists and are like, I get it. And it's like, no, open the book. You haven't, like, go past the introduction, you know, like, get into the work that I'm doing, you know?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. This conversation is so needed. I love it. That scanning, you're like, the Iyapo Repository is not something you can scan. I love that the engagement of the work is not self-evident in those terms. Like, you really, you need a different kind of engagement as a viewer. And that kind of, like, I know the approach you're talking about. Like, I can't pretend that that's not part of my vocabulary when I look at things. I wanted to ask, like, there's something interesting in this conversation where it's like about the instability of the archive. Like, that's one point of view, right? The instability of the archive. And then, like, it's always there. It's the narrative. Like, the archive is actually, it's always there, but everything else around it is what's unstable, right? It's the future. It's what you can't predict. That's the dynamic stuff, which in turn then makes you have to reflect again on the past and the present, being like holding that instability. And I was, in listening to where all this conversation went, I was thinking of my own experiences in the archive at the U, looking at a Black arts movement poet, Etheridge Knight, and how it really challenged my looking at his work. Trying to map where this poet was in time and why his identity struggles in his papers were such, and what issues he was coming against with articulating his Blackness and being an ex-con, and like the moment in which he went into prison in 1968 and the moment in which he leaves are two different moments in terms of how to articulate his identity as a Black man. And looking at having to be like, okay, my methods kind of need to change versus when I was looking at, let's say, other white poets and their archives. For example, trying to get a sense of where is this person in place. And I had to look at event flyers and posters and think about that as like a way of reading, like, okay, what do these posters or flyers reveal? Just their own design, and also the way that Black studies programs were affiliated with this person, and that being a way of tracking him. There's a question. So just like in terms of methods, I'm curious, right? Like how did you have to, in conceiving of this project, and it sounds like, right, there are many iterations and versions of the repository and components. How does the archivist become redefined? Like, or what are synonyms for like what an archivist is or does? Like, are they an explorer? Or, and also like, yeah, synonyms for their methods. Because I feel like in looking at this work and hearing all of y'all's conversation, the methods are not the historical ones, the academic ones that seem like relevant anymore.
I think like our archivists are employing participatory action research as a methodology. And there are institutions that already do this. You know, it's not something we invented. The Schomburg Center in Harlem is a neighborhood archive, like resource library and archive. You know, like they take submissions from their neighbors and work with them to figure out how to best tag and add keywords to these objects and, you know, materials that they're submitting. So then these objects, these materials that are submitted to this institution, 100 years from now, when someone goes in, it's not somebody with a PhD, you know, who's like tagged and written about this history. It's the person who submitted it, you know. And so that sort of like self-driving archival initiative, I think, is something that we're motivated to like support and do and prop up.
And I think one of the great benefits of that is that it more accurately depicts or notes what's happening. So, for example, in studying science fiction is one understands science fiction as the fears of the present and the anxieties of the present. So, in looking at these manuscripts, you see that. You see people. You could track the concerns of, let's say, like a few years ago, even now, but a few years ago, all the police activity with young black men. You could track that in the archive. You could see in terms of the records that are in the archives, different people are concerned about this, and they create projects that relate to that. So it's quite possible to look at the archive and sort of see the anxiety that people are feeling and how they choose to reflect on that and how they choose to express that. And I think one thing that we're considering doing, or that we've started doing, is transcribing all of this and making it all searchable. And then from that, then doing some sort of putting algorithms on it to try to get more information about how the manuscripts relate to each other.
Yeah, we have tons of like worksheets, manuscripts around policing, and then we kind of move into more climate-oriented manuscripts. We have a lot of people worried about like how they're going to eat healthy, clean things, and then 45 happened, and now people are anxious about a whole other monster, you know?
To me, it's really cool because this idea that how everyone described the artist to represent the ideal solution to current issues or anxieties that we're having. Most art represent that, or like at least bring solace to that, or bring attention to that. But then we have all these everyday people doing the same when given the chance to do that, and to see that shows how much art is connected in this our idea of like relating to one another and speaking to one another. And that's all I had to say.
Just one more thing on this. When we sit down and we talk about this, it gets so meta because you know we're talking about communities archiving, and then we take that and then we produce this and produce it, and then on top of all of that, you know, is just so we're talking about the archivists, right? Where the participants are the archivists in our example, but also the institution, which is the Iyapo Repository, and then now looking at past institutions and how they've archived artifacts from people of color, and what can we say about that in the way that we structure our archives, you know, and what can we say about accessibility? What can we say about not only physical accessibility to the object, but accessibility to electronic documents or to all of that? And that's still something that we're trying to figure out, is like in terms of an institution, how does Iyapo Repository address those past issues?
And as a historian thinking about archival methods, I think one of the things, and especially also as a historian that also does a little bit of digital humanities and digital history, one of the concerns that as I think about the archive that I'm creating with the class I teach, we are really concerned about metadata, right? And so it's the metadata actually that if you properly tag and properly categorize, that is what's going to determine what comes up in your searches, right? And so if you are not properly tagging and categorizing or representing what people are bringing to the archive correctly, then it won't even come up. It won't even come up in a search, right? And so the reason why, again, Black women don't come up because the metadata is non-existent, so they won't come up. And so thinking about metadata, how we tag things, how do we categorize things, and having that come from the archivists, the participants, is a new way of thinking about archival work, a new way of, in some senses, reconfiguring the archive.
Do you want to say something? Or can I ask my question? I have like 2 lines of thought, and my first one is like, so my mother taught me that like healers are actually like proactive thinkers about like futures of the problem. So I was wondering like, how do you define healing, and do you see it like what the work you're doing is healing? And then my second question is like, I saw the tension here, and I thought it was like about stereotype threat, and like, do you feel like you're redefining humanity with this project? So like, do you feel like you're redefining what it means of healing work? Because I see the work y'all talking about is healing problems, like in a proactive way. And like, do you feel like you're expanding our definition of what it means to be human? Because like the difference between being an artist and a Black artist is that like being Black itself is not seen as being human. So like, what y'all think about those 2 things?
Well, it's healing in the sense that, at least for me, like I focus a lot on this idea of like oral history and how that's told, and like you remember every single story about what not to do because it would give you bad luck, and like how much you always knock on wood when you say certain things. And like for us, having people create stuff and like that's based on this imagination, it comes from things that they're fearful on an impractical level sometimes, and also having to know that there's a piece of you that exists as a legacy, like that's a huge human thing to want. Like, have I lived my life correctly? Have I lived the life that I wanted to live? Or have I left enough of me behind in a way that exists of like having an immortalized sense? And I think that Iyapo does that in really well in sort of engaging with people in the sense that when you decide to create and like draw something that exists for you and you use your imagination, at least in my opinion, what you're doing is you're allowing who you are to exist in a certain way on paper, in a way that someone else is going to take, in a way that is important to them. And to me, that human connection, that story that you just shared, and me remembering that artifact you created, create a sense of connection, whether or not if we ever see each other, because it's something that will be passed down when someone else read it, when someone else sees it. And that to me is what it means to be human, and that's what it means to be healing. And in that sense, it also helped this idea of like being heard as a Black person, being seen as a Black person. And I think that we do that really well, but that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, our workshops are kind of like, for me anyways, like healing circles, right? Because you bring into the workshop whatever you were reading that day, whoever you are that day, right? The headlines you saw kind of inform what you draw on this piece of paper. And so then you're given an opportunity to sort of like go around the circle and say, this is what I drew, this is why I drew it. And like, then we talk about, we unpack that, right? We're like, how you feeling today? Like, what happened? Like, or there's a lot of like, like, yes. So, and in this way, like when the second question on like a humanness, like, yes, then you like acknowledge our sensitivities, right? Like our tenderness as people. And like, it's a uniquely human moment where you can sit with someone and say like, these are my fears and my anxiety or my hopes. And like, this is how they exist in a physical object form, So yes, I think of it as healing personally.
Hi. I don't know if everyone's hearing me properly. Okay. Hi. I wanted to talk about one thing and then and ask a question about another thing. So I think earlier when you all were talking about black and blackness is the fact that I want to bring up that the term black and blackness was kind of given to us or put on us. Like, it wasn't a term that we coined ourselves, and that's why, like, you can't define people of African descent with the term black because it was created in originality not to be inclusive of everything. And it wasn't a term that was given to have, like, humanity or anything attached to it. So when you're trying to define what blackness is, it's a term that we shouldn't even be using technically because it doesn't even give you the opportunity or nor the space to include all people of African descent and what they mean in their cultures and their background. So, like, so when we're going back and forth, it's like it's so hard to like try to figure out and try to express to people who we are, but we're using a term that we shouldn't even be associating with ourselves because it was negative to begin with. And I think that that's kind of like what the issues with when it comes to showing blackness or defining blackness or like, and the like the example you gave with like blackness or being black was like squashed and you didn't describe anything else that came with it because it wasn't a term that was meant to do that. And I think that's kind of like what just highlights all the like frustration with it. And I wanted to offer up a question because I kind of was going through different kinds of terms, and you know, when you call yourself a title, it's kind of like knowing what it means and where it comes from. And I think when you guys are talking about black feminism, what do you think about that in comparison to womanism? Because I think coming with the idea like when we're talking about creating platforms for black women, it's like you can't use the oppressors' outlines, you can't use their blueprints because that's what oppresses in the first place. So we have to create our own in order for us to be successful. So what about the term womanism instead of black feminism, or why do you prefer one or the other? And also like creating platforms that have the essence of black women instead of using an example that was already created to restrict us. Sorry, I don't know if that came out right. I tried to phrase it.
I mean, I'm looking for language that is like, can be the most inclusive, you know? So like, even when we say we want to look to, you know, black women, I'm like, yes, absolutely, but how do we look to like black queer women, black trans women, you know, like, you know, like I want to take it one step further. So like, even I look, like I love Miss Alice, so yes, womanism, definitely, you know, like that's a term I use, but like I can't even get hung up on the difference between the two, because like neither is really inclusive, you know, like where do like gender non-conforming people fall into this conversation, you know? And so so it's, I don't know like what language to use. I'm just like using the words, you know, to like see, like, can we meet each other somewhere, you know? Like I feel like so much of like my political leanings kind of are rooted in looks. You know, when something like sort of terrible happens and you find the other like person of color in the room and you kind of just look at each other. That's kind of like where my politics are right now. I don't have the side eye. That's like where my politics are. I haven't found the right language yet, but I'd love to brainstorm collectively. Like what are people using? What are the words people are using? I don't know.
All you know, gender nonconforming and whatever. It's just to like I wasn't saying that they both weren't inclusive. It's just like, how can we even like try to coin that, because those terms are inclusive. Like she was saying, black women, we're fighting for everyone, to include everyone, to raise everyone, but the words necessarily wasn't saying that, and it's kind of hard. Yeah, I definitely.
I mean, at least for me, I've always understood it not so much to be a language thing as so much as this desire to have a platform and a collective that is understood, that is fighting for a certain thing, and like that is under this like umbrella term. And like it's just easier to use language that already existed and like to understand that for everyone else in general. And I know like certain words can be reclaimed and certain words can be has meaning to it that is that has connotation, and that's language in general. Like and I don't think it's necessarily bad, in my opinion. And I think that the way we talk about things always has to do with language rather than actually what we're doing. And for me, it's like I wish it will be less focused on that, less focused on like trying to find a term, more about like figuring out how to make those issues come into a place that we're helping them happen and fixing them, and like having policies change based on that, rather than we need a name first, you know. And it's like, it's interesting to always see that, because it's like, it's always a thing. It's like, no, we need to focus on this, or we need to focus on that. But it's like, none of that will matter if we don't have the issues, you know. And it's like, I don't even want to have to be like black feminism ever again. That's my thing, you know. And it's like, and also for me, feminism is not even for me as a woman, it's for men. It's for people who are not going through what I'm going through. I'm already a feminist because I have to deal with these issues, you know? And so because of that, I think that it has to be understood, like, at least for me, feminism is not for black people or black women. It's not for trans, queer women or any of that. It's for the people who doesn't understand what we have to go through in the day-to-day and living our lives, and like strategically figuring out how to bang our head against the wall several times a day, you know, about like the littlest things, you know. And like, and that's where it becomes a problem for me, because I don't need to be raised under like feminism boys do, you know. Boys need to be told how to treat women properly. Boys need to be told, like, you can't fucking beat your girlfriend to death just because she didn't do this one thing. And like, that's where it becomes an issue for me, because it's not about something that women have to do so much as the rest of the world, or the rest of men and other people have to be taught, and white women have to be taught how the things that we go through, the things that we have to deal with, and all these issues, and how to fix that, and like understand that, and create better policies that are more equal to us, you know, because we already been through that.
But we're all we're all socialized under like patriarchal structures. So like, we all need that, you know, we all need that training, we all need that learning. But I agree with you that we need, I don't know, like I hear you in that we like need to focus on the issues first and then come up with language. And I like value your question for that reason, that like we need these anchors, we need words, so we're all on the same page, you know. So I don't know, I think that's something that we should be doing collectively. I don't have the answers, I'm learning every day, you know. So, but yeah.
I think we're at a really good point now to maybe dismiss and continue this amazing conversation among one another. I want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much to our guest artists. I couldn't be more thrilled to have you here, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have this conversation here. So hopefully we can continue this conversation. Feel free to head back to the gallery to take in Iyapo Repository. Feel free to talk to the artists and one another about these very issues.